Hey guys, tonight we're heading into the clattering, clanging, wonderfully reeking heart of Elizabethan London, a city of wooden beams, ankle-deep mud, open sewage ditches, and very, very suspicious dogs. You're not stepping into Shakespeare's sanitized stage version. No, this is the real place, where the Thames smells like last week's oysters, chamber pots fly out windows, and someone's definitely lost a wig in a gutter. Picture it. The sun's dipped behind soot-black chimneys, and candlelight flickers across warped glass windows. Horse carts creak over cobblestones. Somewhere in the distance, a dog howls. Not a wolfy, noble howl, but the short, panicked yelp of a mutt realizing it's being chased by a man with a rope and questionable hygiene. You're here for two of the oddest careers ever dreamed up by public health policy: professional dog catchers and official wig inspectors. Yes, they existed. Yes, they were paid. No, you probably wouldn't survive either job, especially not in hose and a rough collar. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And let me know in the comments where you're watching from and what time it is where you are. I love seeing how far this sleepy little channel reaches. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You begin your evening stroll near Cheapside, where the market stalls are being packed away and the smell of smoked eel still lingers. Beneath your shoes is the familiar slick of mud, animal waste, and whatever unfortunate contents someone's tossed from a second-story window. You're not alone. Stray dogs roam freely in this part of town, darting between carts and barking at shadows. Some of them are skinny and limping. Others seem almost smug, tails wagging with the sort of swagger that says, "Yes, I ate your meat pie. What of it?" In Elizabethan London, dogs weren't just pets. They were scavengers, companions, vermin, and occasionally suspects. Historians still argue whether dogs were truly more populous than humans in some quarters of the city, but there's no question that the streets were teeming with them. These weren't the manicured lapdogs of Versailles. They were rough-coated survivors, rat chasers, bone thieves, and, if they were lucky, beloved by some child who gave them a name and scraps. Of course, you couldn't walk 5 blocks without tripping over one or two. And while many Londoners tolerated the canine chaos, the authorities didn't always share the sentiment, especially when plague came calling. You see, every time an outbreak crept through the alleyways, leaving chalk marks on doors and funeral bells in its wake, suspicion inevitably turned toward the dogs. Were they spreading it? Were they cursed? Could you really trust a creature that licked its own? Well, you get the point. Cue the first appearance of what would eventually become a strange and grim job title, dog catcher. But we're not there yet. Right now, the city is just starting to think about control. And by control, we mean flailing attempts at public health policy, wrapped in moral panic and carried out with little more than nets, clubs, and very vague job descriptions. You pass the butcher's row, where stray pups linger hopefully, tails wagging as cleavers thud onto chopping blocks. One fat old dog is sleeping directly on a pile of sawdust and hooves. No one shoos him away. In fact, the butcher steps over him like he's part of the furniture. It's oddly cozy, if you ignore the smell. As you round the corner near a narrow alley called Dunghill Lane, yes, that's its actual name, a dog dashes out, narrowly avoiding a cartwheel. He's got a ham bone clamped in his mouth and the most self-satisfied eyes you've ever seen. Somewhere, someone's stew is missing its main ingredient. There were no garbage collectors, no sealed bins, no tidy curbside pickup in Elizabethan London. Dogs were a kind of living disposal unit, but they were also loud, unpredictable, and occasionally rabid. And when rabies struck, oh boy, things got ugly fast. People feared rabid dogs the way we fear zombies in movies: frothing mouths, mad dashes, and bites that could mean weeks of terror before death. In some records, entire streets were locked down over a single bite. So while many saw dogs as lovable freeloaders, others saw them as walking biohazards. It didn't help that Queen Elizabeth herself was famously fond of her spaniels, doting on them while officials wrestled with how to stop packs of flea-bitten hounds from spreading disease. And those wigs? Don't worry, we're getting there. But first, let's finish tonight's stroll past the city gates, where a tired dog lies curled up beside a night watchman. The two share a glance. Not enemies, not quite friends, just two creatures surviving another London evening, mud, fleas, and all. You keep walking, boots squelching lightly in the muck, and the smell of roast chestnuts mingles with horse sweat and wet timber. Ahead, under a crooked signboard for the Spotted Pike, a pair of dogs are wrestling, playfully, mostly, though one gives a sharp yelp and skitters off. No one seems to notice. That's just London ambiance. But tonight, you're thinking about a question that haunted city officials for decades. How many dogs is too many? Turns out, there were a lot of dogs, and not the kind you'd find in a royal kennel. No purebred poodles or dainty lapdogs here. We're talking street-smart mongrels, part mastiff, part terrier, part who knows what. They lived under carts, behind taverns, in the straw piles behind stables. And they weren't all strays either. Many had semi-owners, shopkeepers who tossed them bones, widows who let them sleep by the hearth in exchange for protection, or children who swore up and down that the flea-ridden mutt trailing them was Sir Barkington the Brave. Dogs were everywhere because they were useful. In a city overrun with rats, rotting food, and dark alleys where suspicious activity was practically a pastime, a good bark could be worth more than a night watchman's whistle. But usefulness has a funny way of evaporating when fear rolls in. See, whenever plague showed up, and it always came back eventually, the finger-pointing began. And dogs? They were easy targets. They scratched, they slobbered, they darted between people. And while fleas were the real problem, nobody knew that yet. To the average Elizabethan, dogs just looked contagious. Historians still argue whether early public ordinances targeting stray dogs were motivated by genuine health concerns or just panic in a lacy collar. Either way, the solution was swift and grim. Reduce the population. Mass roundups, culls, bounties. And so, the job of dog catcher slowly came into its own. Now, this wasn't a refined civil service post. You didn't get a tidy office and a velvet-lined net. You got a pole with a loop, a sack, and a half-memorized list of whose dog was legal and whose was, let's say, expendable. You had to know your neighborhoods, who tied a red ribbon around their hound's neck every morning to signal it was owned, who'd recently lost a dog and was now calling in false reports to keep it from being taken, and of course, which mongrel had learned to bolt the second it heard your boots. In one surviving record from Southwark, a man named Giles Smeeth was paid £1 a day to patrol for beasts of the four-legged variety, unmuzzled and unclaimed. Sounds dignified, right? What it really meant was dragging a wooden cart around, trying to coax suspiciously intelligent dogs into surrendering themselves for dubious rewards. Spoiler, they rarely did. Dog catchers became both feared and mocked. You'd get children trailing behind you, barking, market women shouting curses, butchers tossing scraps behind your back to lure dogs away. It was a thankless, nippy, occasionally heroic profession. And as you wander past Bread Street, where the scent of yesterday's ale is still sticky in the cracks of the cobbles, you notice something new. Signs posted on the sides of public wells and parish doors. No loose dogs, by order of the watch. Because when panic was high, even the neighborhood mutt could become a scapegoat. If there were too many dogs in your area, you might get fined. If your dog bit someone, even by accident, you could be charged with assault by proxy. And if your dog looked sick, just looked sick, then the constable and the dog catcher might come knocking. Now, here's the irony. Many Elizabethans truly loved dogs. There are poems from the era that praise their loyalty, their playfulness, even their moral superiority to some humans. People wept when their dogs died. Some had them buried with little headstones. A few even left them property in their wills. But love doesn't always win out when the city starts to smell of death and fear. And fear, in those narrow streets, spread faster than fleas. You pause beside a darkened bakery, its shutters drawn and its sign swinging faintly in the night breeze. A shape rustles in a woodpile nearby. You wait. Out trots a limping old dog with a crooked ear and one milky eye. He doesn't bark. He just gives you a look, not begging, not threatening, just there. And for a moment, you understand why the dog catchers hesitated, why even the strictest of parish beadles sometimes looked the other way. Because London was never quiet. It was a city of sound, bells, boots, gossip, carts, and the occasional dog yapping joyfully into the fog was just part of the rhythm. Still, if you were that unlucky soul paid to thin the herd, you didn't get to philosophize. You had a job to do. And you'd better not let the wrong hound slip by, especially if a noble had recently been nipped, or a magistrate's nephew had stepped in something unsavory. Even in a city as chaotic as Elizabethan London, someone had to decide when a bark was a threat. The sun's gone now, fully tucked behind London's jagged skyline of steeples, gallows, and wobbly timber houses. You keep moving, the sound of your steps muffled by straw and filth, past a row of taverns spilling out light and laughter, and the occasional drunken lute solo. But beneath the merriment, there's a darker hum. Because in this city, one word always hovers in the back of every throat, like the faint smoke of a distant fire: plague. Not just any illness, not a sniffle, not a fever. The plague. Bubonic, black-spotted, corpse-cart-worthy plague. And here's where the dogs come under serious suspicion. You may already know the basics. Fleas on rats, fleas bite humans, humans die horribly, end of story. But back then, people didn't know the details. They just knew it spread, fast. And anything that looked dirty, moved quickly, or acted erratically became the enemy. Dogs were all three. So when plague season rolled around, and yes, there was a season, like a ghastly holiday, municipal authorities got twitchy. Stray dogs suddenly became a public menace. City officials started drawing up lists of suspected transmitters, which frankly read more like a paranoid scavenger hunt than science. Historians still argue whether dogs truly played any meaningful role in plague outbreaks. Some believe they helped by killing rats. Others think they helped spread fleas. One theory even suggests that, paradoxically, culling too many dogs actually worsened outbreaks by removing flea hosts that weren't human. But in Elizabethan logic, when in doubt, blame the bark. So imagine this. You're a city alderman. It's 1593. Half your district is sick. The other half is panicking. And someone just swore they saw a dog walk into a church and sneeze. You don't wait for more information. You write a proclamation. Something grim, official, and very vague. All idle dogs to be taken and put down by dusk. And who enforces this? Enter the dog catchers. Again. But this time, their job isn't just nuisance control. It's plague prevention. They're supposed to be brave little sanitation soldiers. Of course, they're not trained. There's no handbook, just a few guidelines scrawled on parchment and a verbal directive like, make sure it doesn't come back, yeah? It gets darker. In some parishes, residents were encouraged to report dog sightings, especially if the dog belonged to a neighbor you didn't particularly like. This led to, let's say, creative accusations. Mistress Barnaby keeps 4 devilish hounds beneath her floorboards, and next thing you know, a man with a net and a scowl is knocking on her door. Punishments ranged from warnings to fines to, on rare but recorded occasions, the execution of both dog and owner. Yes, they took it that far. You pause near the entrance to Pudding Lane. It's quiet tonight, which is somehow more unsettling. This is the kind of silence that makes you listen harder, for coughing behind walls, for the shuffle of a dog's paws, for the creak of a cart bearing plague-marked corpses down the road. There's a moment here, strangely tender, where you imagine the dog catchers hesitating, maybe even crying, because not every mutt was mangy. Some were beloved, some wore ribbons, little bells, even tiny collars with names carved into scrap brass. Nell, Pip, Shadow. But a job's a job. And fear makes people do cruel things with unnerving speed. In response to outbreaks, some boroughs even experimented with dog-free zones, cordoning off areas, attempting to regulate canine movement like livestock. Picture a sort of medieval dog checkpoint. But dogs, it turns out, don't care much for municipal boundaries, especially not when bacon is involved. Of course, not all dogs were hunted. The Queen's own spaniels lived like royalty, dining on tripe and being brushed more often than most citizens bathed. They had handlers, pillows, royal names, and most importantly, royal immunity, which tells you everything about the social order. Your dog could be executed for wandering, while Her Majesty's pooch wore lace. You continue your walk through Bishopsgate, where a hound limps past carrying a chicken bone in its jaws. It eyes you warily, not hostile, just aware, as if it knows your face, or at least your job. Here's a fringe fact. One dog, a shaggy mutt known only as Baker's Boy, reportedly survived 3 plague roundups by hiding beneath bread ovens. Some say he was protected by bakers. Others believe he was immortal. Either way, he shows up in multiple accounts, always described the same way. Soot-covered, wiry, one ear missing, tail like a broomstick. Somewhere between myth and mutt. You pause beside a lamppost. Well, what passed for one, a sputtering lantern on a crooked beam, and think about how easy it is to fear the wrong things. Rats, fleas, poverty, crowding, all of them bigger culprits, but it's easier to chase a dog than confront a sewer system. It always is. And so, the dog catchers of Elizabethan London kept doing their rounds, some out of duty, some for coin, and a few, perhaps, out of genuine belief that they were saving lives. Maybe they were, maybe they weren't. But in a city where illness could arrive overnight and vanish just as fast, it was easier to be seen doing something than doing nothing at all. You pass a crooked tavern with an overhanging upper floor, its wooden beams leaning like tired shoulders. From within, the din of laughter, clinking mugs, and a terrible rendition of Greensleeves echoes into the night. But you're not heading inside. You've got a far stranger story to trail tonight, one that starts not with barking, but with powdered wigs. Yes, we're pivoting from dogs to hairpieces, and no, that doesn't make things any less ridiculous. Let's set the scene. It's still London, still the same cobbled chaos of the late 1500s. You're still dodging chamber pot splash zones and breathing in a fragrant mix of fish guts and chimney soot. But now, you're stepping into the elite world of powdered wigs. They weren't quite in vogue yet during the early Elizabethan period, not the tall, fluffy monstrosities of Louis XIV's France. But wigs, called periwigs in the era, were catching on, subtly at first, a little length here, a tuft there. By the late 1500s, upper-class men and women alike were beginning to experiment with hair that didn't quite belong to them. Queen Elizabeth I herself had a legendary collection, more than 80 wigs if you believe court gossip, each one curled, dyed, and lacquered within an inch of its life. Her favorite? A flaming red number designed to match her royal seal and intimidate visiting diplomats. Naturally, historians still argue whether this wig boom was inspired more by vanity or necessity. After all, lice were everywhere. Bathing was infrequent, and natural hair was a liability. Wigs could be boiled, powdered, and deloused without the awkwardness of sitting in a cold tub beside a frog. But here's the twist. As wig usage rose, so did wig-related problems, specifically the rise of fake wigs, poorly made ones, dirty ones, even, brace yourself, stolen ones. Picture it. You're attending a noble dinner. You're seated beside a duke. You lean forward to comment on the lamb pie, and suddenly, plop, his hair slides into his soup. That's not just embarrassing, that's scandalous. And thus, the city had a crisis, not just of style, but of sanitation. Enter the wig inspectors. No, this wasn't a joke or a Shakespearean comedy character. By the early 1600s, London officials began experimenting with roles tasked with maintaining hygiene standards in wig manufacture and sales. They weren't always called wig inspectors outright. Titles ranged from wardens of Barbary to guild stewards. But the job was clear. Stop disgusting hairpieces from entering polite society. Wig makers were expected to register their products, especially in upscale wards like Cornhill and the Strand. Inspectors would occasionally pop by workshops to examine the hair goods for signs of lice, mold, or questionable sourcing. Some wigs were made from corpses. Yes, really. This wasn't the glamorous life of an Elizabethan fashionista. Imagine spending your days fingering through horsehair glued to sheep gut lace, sniffing for mildew, and interrogating vendors about where they got that lovely ash blonde piece in the window. One recorded case from 1601 details a street fight between two wig sellers, one accusing the other of artificial weaving from ditch-born hair, a phrase that deserves its own sonnet. The inspector who broke it up reportedly fined both men, confiscated their inventory, and left with what was described as a most foul-smelling satchel. And you thought modern customer service was rough, so you keep walking, passing the shuttered windows of a barber surgeon's shop. A brass bowl hangs outside, still slick from whatever strange concoction was used that morning, part bleach, part mercury, part pray it doesn't kill you. Wig inspectors often worked alongside barber surgeons, who were the only people licensed to dress wigs properly. Dressing, in this case, meant cleaning, curling, powdering, and occasionally defleeing with a hot iron comb. Think of it like a medieval blowout, except with more screaming. A wig, to be accepted in respectable circles, had to be well maintained. Shabby wigs reflected a lack of discipline and class. Frizz was a public offense. Powder clumps could be socially fatal. And the worst sin? Smelling like a dog. That's right. We've come full circle. Because many wigs, especially cheap ones, were made of animal fur, goat, horse, and yes, sometimes dog. If a wig inspector suspected your bouffant was a little too woofy, you could be fined or worse, banned from court appearances. There's a surviving note in the guild records referring to one unfortunate merchant who was forced to publicly burn a batch of hound-wrought hairpieces that had caused great offense to the nose. So now imagine it's morning in Elizabethan London. You're a wig inspector. You rise with the sun, put on your plain felt cap, grab your clipboard, or whatever passed for one, and prepare to spend your day smelling strangers' scalps and judging curl tightness. Not exactly a dream career, but in a city where image mattered and where hair could fall out from stress, illness, or heartbreak, someone had to keep standards high, or at least high enough that the queen didn't faint from your dandruff cloud. As you wander down toward the bustling remnants of Fleet Street, passing shuttered print shops and the last whiff of a late-night pie vendor, you begin to realize something curious about the world of Elizabethan regulations. They were often gloriously, hilariously inconsistent. Take the concept of a stray dog, for instance. It sounds simple, right? Dog has no owner equals stray. Wrong. In Elizabethan London, what counted as a stray depended entirely on what neighborhood you were in, who you asked, and, let's be honest, how loud or annoying the dog was at the time. If your dog barked too much, it was a stray. If your neighbor's dog barked the exact same amount but also guarded their ale cart, oh, he was a working animal. Nuance. City ordinances attempted to bring clarity. Some parishes required dog owners to tie colored ribbons around their pets' necks. Red for owned, blue for working, green for... nobody was quite sure. But then dogs would lose the ribbons, or swap them, or eat them. There was even one case where a tavern dog ended up wearing 3 different ribbons at once and caused a minor riot when 2 owners claimed it was theirs. Historians still argue whether the ribbon system was actually enforced or just scribbled into the books to appease an alderman who didn't like barking during sermons. What is clear is that identifying a dog's legal status was about as straightforward as deciphering a toddler's crayon map of the city. You pause beside a public posting wall, one of the few places where proclamations and warnings were nailed up for the semi-literate masses to squint at. Among the usual calls for thieves, missing rings, and he that did grievously insult a fishmonger, there's a new notice in thick black ink. All uncollared dogs to be taken for examination. That examination bit is doing a lot of heavy lifting. In practice, it meant the dog would be seized, inspected for signs of plague, whatever those were, and either returned, fined, or dealt with. But here's the rub. Collars were expensive. Made from leather or scrap metal, they weren't something every family could afford. So poorer households, even if they loved and cared for their dogs, often had no legal proof of ownership. Meanwhile, wealthier owners could commission brass-tagged collars with their initials, home address, and, rumor has it, passive-aggressive poems about dog theft. This created, predictably, a class divide in dog protection. Working-class families lost their pets to roundups, while nobles' dogs barked freely in the park with impunity and little silk bows. Enter the black market collar industry. Yes, you heard that right. Tanners, blacksmiths, and even some wig merchants, because why not, began offering under-the-table collars for poor families who didn't want to lose their pups. Some were real. Others were made of painted wood or rolled parchment, just convincing enough to pass a lazy inspection. One clever fellow reportedly carved his dog's collar out of stale bread. Dog inspectors, naturally, caught on. They became experts in fake collars, learning to tug, prod, and sniff for signs of authenticity. There's one surviving record of a dog named Gobbo being pardoned after it was discovered that his collar was in fact a belt from a child's tunic, cleverly stitched into a loop. And this isn't even getting into the accusations. Imagine the drama. That's my dog, "Nay, sir, I have the collar right here. You painted that with soot and desperation." Court records are littered with small claims involving dogs, bite disputes, collar thefts, accusations of harboring plague dogs. One even involved a duel that started when a hound peed on a magistrate's robes. The dog survived. The magistrate's pride did not. You make your way toward a torch-lit courtyard where the dog catcher's cart is parked. An old creaky thing, its sides scratched by countless claws. Inside, 3 dogs sit sullenly, their eyes reflecting the firelight. One wears a limp piece of ribbon. The others have none. You wonder for a moment how many families might be searching for them tonight. There's something about the ambiguity of ownership here that feels too familiar. A dog can belong to a home, a child, a street, or no one, and that made it very easy for the law to decide what it wanted, depending on the day, the weather, or who was watching. And don't get smug, modern listener. It's not like things are that different now. Raise your hand if you've ever looked at a parking ticket and said, "But I was only there for 5 minutes." Same energy, different century. Still, back in 1590 London, all it took was a misplaced collar or a grumpy neighbor to turn your beloved mutt into contraband, and for the poor dog catcher, underpaid, overbitten, and frequently chased with brooms, it was just another Tuesday. The night deepens, the moon now hanging low like a pale coin lost in chimney smoke. Your breath mingles with the crisp air, tinged with soot and something doggish. You're close to one of the city's public commons now, a muddy green in daylight, but by night, a haven for all things unregulated. And here you see him, the dog catcher, a wiry figure in a patched jerkin, hat pulled low, walking with that peculiar mix of boredom and dread that only someone who expects to be bitten tonight can pull off. A long pole hangs over one shoulder. At the end of it, a noose. Not a hanging rope, mind you, just a simple slip loop made of cord, designed to snag necks quickly and without too much fuss. You step closer, watching him work. He whistles, not cheerfully, more like a habit, something to fill the air. And then he kneels by a pile of firewood and offers a scrap of dried meat. There's a rustle, a pause, and then, cautiously, a dog emerges. It's young, mud-caked, ears flattened. With a sigh, the catcher holds out the loop, lets the dog sniff it, and then, quick as a blink, tightens it around the neck and lifts. Gently, surprisingly, almost tender. But make no mistake, this isn't mercy. It's protocol. You've just witnessed the Elizabethan version of pest control. So what were the perks of being a dog catcher? Well, perks is a strong word. Let's call them questionable fringe benefits. Some parishes offered a daily stipend, usually a few pennies, enough for bread, maybe a pint of weak ale. Others provided payment per dog. That meant incentive, perverse incentive. More dogs, more coin. A slow night meant an empty stomach. Historians still argue whether the per-dog bounty system led to overzealous catching or just encouraged better hustle. But records from several districts show spikes in reported strays whenever a new catcher was hired. Coincidence? Probably not. Now, on occasion, catchers were offered non-monetary bonuses. One record shows a man named Willem receiving 2 measures of ale and half a rabbit for catching a growling black beast that did menace the vicar's piglets. Other perks included access to discarded bread crusts, hand-me-down cloaks from constables, and, in rare cases, lodging in the parish stables with the horses, naturally. Of course, the hazards outweighed the perks by several teeth. Dog catchers were routinely bitten. In fact, being bitten was so expected that one parish ordered a biting log, a handwritten register of who'd been nipped, by which dog, and on what part of the body. The bite chart, if you will. Then there was the social stigma. You weren't a hero, you weren't admired. Children jeered at you. Bakers shooed you away. Dog owners cursed you and threw scraps. Rotten ones. There are records of catchers being denied communion for indelicate work. You were lower than a rat catcher, and they ate what they caught. And yet, some men stuck with it for years. There are mentions of old Remy, a catcher who allegedly worked the Bishopsgate area for over a decade. He was missing 2 fingers, wore the same patched boots year-round, and according to neighborhood children, spoke fluent dog. He could mimic barks and growls to confuse and coax. He also had a reputation for releasing nice ones behind the bakery. Remy was the exception. Most catchers burned out fast. Emotionally, financially, or literally, they'd get scratched, infected, and left untreated. If they were lucky, they'd limp into retirement. If not, they'd become just another name in the biting log. And yet, the job persisted. Because London needed someone to keep the canine population vaguely in check, especially during festivals, funerals, and, oddly, execution days when crowds gathered and food scraps flew. Dogs loved public hangings. It was like a grim county fair to them, raucous, smelly, and full of unattended sausages, which brings us to the darker side of dog catching. Dog disposal. Captured strays weren't kept in cozy kennels. There were no adoption drives or rehabilitation programs. Most were drowned, clubbed, or, if they were lucky, sold to butcher shops for meat, usually passed off as mutton, don't ask. In the South Bank, some were even used for entertainments. Yes, we're going there. Pit fights, bear baiting, dog versus monkey, versus badger, versus your will to live. It was brutal, bloody, popular, and dog catchers, needing coin, sometimes sold their captives to the organizers. It's not easy to romanticize this job. But still, you have to picture them. These grim-faced men dragging carts through fog, muttering to themselves, sometimes crying, sometimes laughing too loud, chasing shadows, collars, and conscience. You pass one now, huddled under an awning, chewing on a piece of jerky, one eye scanning the street for wagging tails. His pole lies across his lap. His boots are soaked, and though he doesn't look noble or brave or particularly clean, he does look necessary. Because when the bells ring, plague or no plague, someone has to answer. The cobbled streets glisten under the thin sheen of midnight dew, and somewhere in the distance, a bell tolls, slow, low, mournful. Whether it marks the hour, a passing, or just someone with a flair for the dramatic, you can't be sure. But it fits the mood. You step off the main road and into a quieter lane where the sharp scent of powder and pomade cuts through the night air. You've entered wig territory now, and things are about to get weird. Let's rewind a bit. We've covered how wigs were growing in popularity during the Elizabethan era, especially among the nobility and upper merchant class. But what we haven't talked about is what those wigs were made of. Spoiler, it wasn't unicorn hair. Most wigs were crafted from human hair, sourced from the living, the willing, and occasionally the dead. If you were lucky, your periwig came from a willing seller, maybe someone who'd fallen on hard times. If you were less lucky, it came from a condemned criminal, or worse, a cadaver whose relatives didn't get there fast enough. But human hair was expensive, so alternatives began creeping in. Goat hair, horse hair, yak, if you could get it. And then, inevitably, dog fur. It wasn't as rare as you'd think. Long-haired breeds like spaniels or setters could be brushed, clipped, or, if you didn't ask too many questions, shaved. Some wig makers even bred dogs just for harvesting fur. Canine wefts, they were called, often sold in bulk, dyed to match auburn or chestnut tones. Historians still argue whether this was widely accepted or quietly scandalous. Some sources suggest that canine-based wigs were a fashionable secret among the less discerning gentry. Others imply that wig inspectors cracked down hard when they caught wind, literally, of a hound blend. Either way, it was a growing issue. And here's where things get spicy: the powder problem. To keep wigs clean, or at least less filthy, wearers would dust them with powders, usually made of starch or crushed bone, sometimes scented with lavender or orange peel. The richer you were, the more fragrant your dome. The poorer? Well, you just smelled like musty bread. But powdered wigs had a major flaw. They were flammable. One tiny ember from a pipe, one accidental brush against a candelabra, and poof, your head became a fire hazard. There's a recorded incident of a minor noblewoman in Blackfriars whose entire wig ignited at a dinner party. The records don't say whether it was the wig, the wine, or her wit that caused the spark, but suffice it to say, the guests were very entertained. You wander past a shuttered wig-maker's shop now, its window display still faintly lit. A mannequin bust wears a gravity-defying silver cascade, curls lacquered into spirals so tight you wonder if they could cut cheese. Next to it sits a tray of powder puffs, one labeled Civet Musk Blend, Extra Resilient. You shudder. Now, into this world of combustibility and questionable hygiene walked the unlikely heroes, wig inspectors, not glamorous, not famous, but necessary, armed with long gloves, sniffing jars, and if the job warranted, a small brush for lice detection. They visited wig makers to ensure standards were being met. They checked for proper washing. They tested powder ratios. And most importantly, they tried to identify fake wigs. Yes, fake wigs. Wigs that were advertised as human hair, Egyptian imported, silk blended, but were actually made from the back end of a goat and dusted with week-old flour. Consumer fraud isn't new, my friend. Some wig inspectors developed reputations. There was Master Gorin of Southwark, known for fainting dramatically whenever he encountered a moldy weave. Mistress Bellamy of Shoreditch, who carried a perfumed handkerchief and was rumored to travel with her own lice-sniffing dog. And perhaps the most feared of all, Inspector Chalice, a bald man with a vendetta. They say he once shut down an entire street of wig merchants because one dared to laugh at his natural dome. Inspections weren't daily, but they were random and terrifying. One moment, you're dusting your wares. The next, a cloaked figure barges in, demands to see your powders, then shoves a gloved finger into your latest masterpiece and declares it unfit for scalp. You glance at your own reflection now in a shop window, the foggy glass distorting your face. You imagine what it would have been like to wear a wig every day, not for fashion, but for survival. Because in those days, baldness was suspicious. It implied illness, scandal, or worse. French habits. Yes, truly. There's even a play from the time where a villain is revealed when his wig falls off and someone gasps, a French pate. To be hairless by choice was considered foreign and therefore deeply untrustworthy. So people covered up, even if it meant glue, goat hair, and powdered starch that made your head smell like Sunday dinner gone wrong. And wig inspectors? They were the gatekeepers of this weird, frizzy world. They didn't wear badges. They didn't carry swords. But they could ruin your business with a single sniff. As you ease into the next stretch of cobbled road, a faint dusting of powder tickles your nose. Whether it's from a poorly sealed wig shop nearby, or the ghost of someone's fashion choices lingering in the air, you'll never know. But one thing's for sure. Elizabethan London had a peculiar obsession with appearances, and no appearance was complete without a freshly powdered head and hopefully no visible insects. Which brings us back to the wig inspectors, not just quiet enforcers of vanity, but unexpected allies in the war against lice, mold, and the occasional rodent stowaway. At this point in the city's wig craze, demand had begun to outpace quality. Anyone with a patch of floor, a comb, and access to questionable hair sources could call themselves a wig maker. That meant standards suffered. And so the job of wig inspector evolved from a part-time powder sniffer to a full-time forensic analyst of scalp fashion. But they didn't work alone. Enter the barber surgeons. If you're new to Elizabethan career overlaps, let's clarify. A barber surgeon was exactly what it sounds like. A person who would trim your beard and remove your infected tooth, sometimes in the same appointment. These were the jack-of-all gory trades types, equipped with razors, leeches, scissors, and what they described as a good bedside manner. Others may have disagreed. They also happened to be the era's primary wig dressers. Why? Because they had the tools, hot irons to shape curls, oils to soften horsehair, pumice stones to remove louse eggs, and the training, sort of, to tell when a wig was crawling with guests. Historians still argue whether the cooperation between wig inspectors and barber surgeons was formal or just convenient. Some cities had formal guild relationships. Others seemed to operate on mutual annoyance. The inspectors didn't want to touch anything, and the barbers didn't want to fill out paperwork. Together, though, they maintained a kind of chaotic order. You pass one of their shops now, marked with the familiar red and white pole. Yes, the same one you still see outside barbers today. Back then, it symbolized blood and bandages. Cheerful. Inside, you hear a scraping noise and muffled cursing. Probably someone getting a boil lanced while their wig is steamed. It's around this time that powdered wig maintenance started developing into its own strange ritual. Once a week, sometimes more often if you were high society, you'd bring your wig in for a full dressing. This involved brushing out the old powder, which clumped with sweat into something resembling stale pastry dough, repowdering with fresh starch, curling the edges with iron rods heated over coals, and sometimes applying scented oils or citrus peels to mask odors. Sounds pleasant? It wasn't. If you had lice, it got worse. Barber surgeons used a mixture of vinegar, ash, and boiling water. You sat in a chair while your wig was deloused like a barn cat. It stung. It smelled. And if the barber was feeling lazy, it might just be replaced entirely. No refunds. Still, people lined up for this. Because to appear wigless in public, especially if your natural hair had thinned or, heaven forbid, gone gray, was a kind of social misdemeanor. You might as well announce to the world that you'd lost your fortune, your reputation, and possibly your teeth. And the wigs themselves? They grew wilder by the decade. Toward the turn of the 17th century, styles ballooned, literally. Towering confections of curls and buns, braided in loops, and dusted with ever more daring powders. Charcoal for edge, violet for flirtation. One recorded instance describes a merchant's wife whose wig contained a working model of a windmill. The account doesn't confirm whether it turned, but one can dream. This presented new challenges for inspectors. How do you check a wig that's taller than a bishop? How do you inspect for lice in a hairpiece decorated with miniature ship sails and twine rigging? There's one truly tragicomic record of an inspector who got tangled in a client's wig garden, a style featuring tiny silk flowers and a live canary. He never inspected again. You stop beside a street vendor now, selling what he claims are licensed wig powders. The bags look suspiciously like flour. A small sign reads, "Buy 2, get a ribbon for free." Next to him is a cage with 2 rats. Their sign says, "Wig quality testers." They know a fraud when they chew one. It's hard to tell if it's a joke or a marketing tactic, but you wouldn't put it past London. So here we are, in a world where fashion meant fire risk, personal style was potentially vermin-infested, and the line between vanity and public health was so blurred, it might as well have been drawn in soap on foggy glass. But someone had to draw that line, and that someone, more often than not, was the lowly, underappreciated, slightly itchy wig inspector, working side by side with the barber surgeon, sharing complaints, powder, and probably a great deal of lice. The air begins to change as you leave the barber's quarter. The smells shift too. Less of scorched horsehair and vinegar, more of damp brick, ale, and the subtle undercurrent of resentment. You're now moving through one of London's many mixed wards, where wig inspectors were viewed not as guardians of cleanliness, but as the most annoying people to ever sniff a powdered scalp. And you're about to find out why. Because for every careful wig maker following guild standards, there were 3 others cutting corners, blending mystery hair with questionable powders, and hoping no one noticed. The problem? The inspectors noticed, and when they did, fines were issued, sometimes heavy ones. A record from 1603 details a wig maker named Tobias Filch, who was fined 6 shillings and 1 brush of public shame for selling periwigs made from unvetted beast hair. It turns out he'd been sweeping up dog fur from a local butcher's kennel and weaving it into elegant curls. The worst part? Customers didn't complain until the wigs began to shed. So the inspectors cracked down, growing bolder and more creative. They'd sniff powders to detect spoiled flour. They'd unpick seams to check for hidden rot. They even developed a simple test. If you lit a match and waved it near the wig and it sizzled, it was considered unsafe. This resulted in at least 1 shop burning down. Don't worry, no wigs were injured. But it wasn't just the powder and the hair, it was the structure. Wig construction was an art, a base of tightly woven lace or linen, stitched hair in neat rows, set upon a wooden frame or padded cap. Poorly made wigs itched, slipped, and occasionally collapsed under their own ambition. One infamous case involved a judge's wig falling apart mid-trial. The defense lawyer reportedly shouted, "Objection! His honor hath split." It became a tavern joke for years. But as wig culture expanded, the stakes got higher. The courts, the churches, the theater, all of them depended on the proper wig. It wasn't just fashion. It was identity. A clergyman without his powdered bob might be mistaken for a tax collector. An actor without his long locks couldn't play a king. A merchant without his curled temples might lose a sale. And that's where the real trouble began. Enforcement. Wig inspectors now had the power to confiscate wigs deemed unfit. Imagine the scene. A nobleman at a dinner, his carefully chosen curls catching candlelight, when an inspector arrives and whispers, "Sir, your headpiece violates Article 4. And just like that, gone. Sometimes these seizures were ceremonial. Other times, they were sneak attacks. There are stories of wigs being snatched off heads mid-speech. At least one bishop is recorded to have tripped on a rug while chasing down an inspector who libeled my hair with impudence. You're passing a church now, its windows dark, its door ajar for late-night prayer. But on its steps is a carved bench, common enough, where a small plaque reads, "Here lay the wig of Lord Berwick, removed by force, 1611. No further explanation, just a tribute to a very public humiliation." It wasn't just a matter of sanitation. It was pride. A bad wig could ruin a reputation faster than a bad poem. And wigs weren't cheap. A well-made periwig could cost half a laborer's annual wage. Losing one to an inspector meant not just embarrassment, but financial loss. So the merchants pushed back. They bribed inspectors, hid the good wigs in locked trunks, displayed fake wigs in the shop window, and passed the real ones in secret. Some even staged fake lice outbreaks just to delay inspections. A truly inspired scam involved a cleaning fog machine, essentially a pan of boiling lavender water shoved under a wig to make it seem sanitized. It worked, until one caught fire. And yet, the inspectors kept coming, unmoved, unsmiling, armed with ribbons of authority and a firm sense of smell. You stop now in front of an unassuming doorway with a small bronze symbol above it, a wig stand and 2 crossed combs. It's one of the Inspector Guild halls, or was once. It's boarded up now, the paint faded, the scent of powder long gone. But back then, this was the seat of judgment, the place where wig makers came to register their goods, where disputes were settled, where powder formulas were tested under controlled conditions, meaning someone sneezed into them and everyone watched what happened. And while the official records show guild minutes, regulations, and ledgers, there's also a ledger of, let's call them memorable confiscations. Entries like, 1 curly mess from Dr. Folk, held together by marmalade. Wig of unknown origin, possibly a raccoon. Item, 2-tiered wig with false coin hidden in the lining. It's not clear whether these notes were written in jest or frustration, possibly both. But what is clear, inspectors were just as human as the rest of the city. Some had favorite wig makers, some showed mercy, some wielded their authority like a sword made of starch, and occasionally, some just walked out, muttering, "If I see one more dog curl masquerading as gentleman's fringe, I shall take vows." You turn onto a side street now, narrower than the rest, where the buildings lean in like gossiping neighbors. The signs hanging overhead creak on their iron rods, announcing shops long closed, buttons and bristles, the honest stitch, wigs for the discerning and bald. A stray cat watches you pass with regal disapproval. This is where wig inspection met its cousin, law enforcement. Because in Elizabethan London, if something could be taxed, regulated, or judged, it would be. And wigs? Oh, they were ripe for legal entanglement. See, as wigs gained popularity and became embedded in the social fabric, sometimes literally, people sewed them to their hats. Lawmakers saw an opportunity. If you could find someone for carrying spoiled fish or failing to douse their chimney fire, surely you could find them for unsanitary headwear. And they did. Enter the court scrolls, those dusty, verbose records that list every civic misdemeanor from selling watered ale to molesting a public statue. Among them, a surprising number deal with dogs and wigs, sometimes separately, often together. Let's start with the dogs. During plague seasons and royal events, strict ordinances were passed. No loose dogs within the city gates. After sundown, violations, fines, recurring violations, public shaming. There's one account of a man who had to carry a sign reading, "I let my dog roam unleashed," while wearing a jingling collar himself. More common, though, were simple coin fines, usually a few pence, but enough to sting, especially when the dog in question wasn't even yours. "But sir," a butcher once argued, "the dog merely followed me." The judge replied, "Then thou should not smell of tripe, goodman." Now let's revisit the wigs. If your wig was deemed offensive, by smell, by structure, by audacity, you could be fined on the spot. Offenses included excessive powdering, especially in crowded indoor gatherings. Clouding a magistrate's vision was considered a threat to civic order. Obstruction of view. Theater-goers with especially tall wigs were often asked to remove them or be fined a penny per inch above eyebrow level. Public molt. If your wig began to shed in public and left more than 3 visible strands on a bench, you were fined for decorative littering. But the most amusing, and honestly most frequent, legal squabble of the era was wig theft. Yes, wig snatching was rampant. Children did it for fun. Pickpockets did it for profit. Rival wig makers sometimes staged elaborate schemes to swipe popular styles from competitors. One especially bold thief disguised himself as a wig inspector and went door to door confiscating high-quality goods. He disappeared into the night and was never caught. Historians still argue whether wig theft was a product of necessity, mischief, or just opportunism. But one thing's certain: people were very protective of their periwigs. You pass a courthouse now, silent, stoic, moss growing on the stones. Above the door is a carving of justice blindfolded and wearing a rather fine curled wig. Whether it's satire or civic pride, no one's quite sure. Inside these walls, countless trials played out with wigs as evidence. There's a record from 1609 in which 2 women wrestled in the market over a fallen wig. The owner claimed it. The accused claimed she made it. The judge ruled in favor of the one with fewer bite marks. Another case involved a man who claimed to have invented the self-cleaning wig. Upon demonstration, it burst into flames. He was fined for endangerment and briefly celebrated as a folk hero. There were even punishments involving wigs. In some wards, those caught lying in court were sentenced to wear a wig dyed bright green for a week, marked with the word falsifier. It was meant as a warning. Instead, it became a minor fashion trend among rebellious youths. Of course, enforcement varied wildly. Some inspectors were zealous, others lazy. One famously lazy inspector was known to sniff a wig and declare it passable, so long as the wearer offered him lunch. In contrast, another, Master Ignatius Prim, was so feared that wigmakers left offerings at his door: sweetmeats, combs, even small coins, hoping to appease him before inspection day. And don't think dogs escaped legal creativity. Some parishes tried licensing them, complete with engraved brass tags. Others required owners to swear oaths like, "I, Elspeth of the Spitalfields, do affirm that bumbles be not prone to biting nor possessing plague." Violators were sometimes ordered to walk their dogs on leashes made of colored ribbon, so the community would know they'd broken the law. It was public penance, adorable, humiliating, and surprisingly effective. So you see, even the smallest things, a barking mutt, a sagging wig, could land you in front of a judge. And while the punishments weren't always harsh, they were memorable. London, after all, was a city held together not just by stone and timber, but by reputation, routine, and the quiet terror of being called out for a fashion faux pas in open court. It's nearly dawn now, the sky softening to a gray-blue rinse, the stars fading like powdered specks on velvet. You move through the sloping alleys behind Smithfield Market, past barrels stacked like tired guards and doorways that still smell faintly of mutton. There's a stillness here, but you know better. Wig-related crime never sleeps. And here, under a slanted wooden awning, you stumble across one of the stranger urban legends of the time, the Great Wig Heist. Let's be clear, wig theft wasn't a new phenomenon. But in the early 1600s, as wigs became not just accessories but investments, the stakes grew. These weren't just hairpieces. They were symbols of class, power, and let's be honest, the ability to pay someone else to deal with your lice, which made them prime targets for every enterprising pickpocket, prankster, and rogue apprentice in town. Children were particularly good at it. They'd spot an unsuspecting gentleman browsing meat pies, hop onto a cart, yank the wig, and vanish down a back alley. Within minutes, that wig could be repowdered, recurled, and resold to someone too embarrassed to ask where it came from. One of the most notorious gangs of wig snatchers were the Street Sparrows, a group of orphan boys who roamed the city, trained in distraction tactics. One would juggle, another would pretend to faint, and the third, light as a breeze, would liberate the nearest headpiece. Their calling card? A feather stuck into the wig's lining with a pin. But the real masters of wig theft? Pigeons. Yes, pigeons. Historians still argue whether this was an urban myth, a misinterpreted anecdote, or the greatest animal crime wave in pre-industrial Europe. But multiple sources, journals, letters, even church sermons, make references to wigs being stolen by birds. The theory was simple. Pigeons, especially nesting females, loved human hair for lining their nests, and wigs, often scented with honeyed oils or citrus, were irresistible. People reported sitting under eaves, only to have their periwig lifted mid-snack. One pamphlet described a lady at court chasing a pigeon across the lawn while shouting, "Return mine curls, thief of heaven." There were attempts to solve this. Hats with chin straps, hairpins shaped like spikes, powder mixes laced with pepper. All failed. Some shops began selling anti-theft wigs with hidden weights or bells, though this made them sag and jingle in awkward social settings. And of course, some wig inspectors got involved, issuing bird warnings alongside mold notices. But pigeons were only part of the problem. Wigs were stolen from windows, benches, even gravestones. Yes, gravestones. One account describes mourners arriving at a funeral only to find the deceased's burial wig missing. The widow demanded an inquest. The inspector found it later, on the head of a teenage actor performing in Tamburlaine. Speaking of actors, the theater world had its own wig troubles. Playhouses relied on wigs not just for characters, but for entire personas. A single curled blonde wig might be used for both Juliet and Lady Macbeth in the same week, and if it vanished, the whole performance suffered. There's a famous story of a production of King Lear where the lead's wig was stolen mid-scene. He had to finish the play wearing a mop. The theft wasn't always random. Rival troupes stole wigs from each other. So did disgruntled ex-lovers, unpaid apprentices, and, once, a goose. Long story, possibly exaggerated. The point is, wigs were currency, and no one was safe. Which led to some creative responses. Some wig makers hired guards, others trained dogs. Yes, the narrative loops back again, to sit beneath windows and bark at suspicious movement. One particularly paranoid craftsman reportedly booby-trapped his wigs with a pouch of flour that exploded if tampered with. He was fined for creating fog and offense. But even among all this mischief, the city still ran on wigs. Court proceedings, church ceremonies, weddings, executions, wigs were worn with reverence and risk. And the laws evolved too. By 1612, a new ordinance stated, "Any wig of more than 5 curls height must be fastened securely by pin, clasp, or divine intervention." It was a joke, sort of. But it became real policy after a baron's wig fell into the Thames during a marriage proposal. You pause now on a footbridge overlooking the river, imagining a wig floating downstream like a lost ghost. It's oddly poetic, a drifting puff of vanity carried away by the tide. And as silly as it sounds, people mourned lost wigs. They'd place ads in print shops. Lost, One fine powdered auburn periwig, last seen at the Swan Tavern. Answers to Millicent, reward offered. Some even held small vigils, gatherings of friends to drink and lament the tragic separation of head and hair. It's easy to laugh, but in a city where identity was so fragile, so performative, so wrapped in starch and silhouette, losing your wig felt a bit like losing your armor. And in London, that could be dangerous. The sky is getting lighter now, that soft oyster glow before the sun decides it's ready to join the chaos. Street cleaners shuffle past you, sweeping up yesterday's regrets with brooms made of bundled twigs. A baker yawns as he opens his shutters. Somewhere nearby, a rooster announces absolutely nothing of consequence, but does it loudly anyway. And amid the stirrings of a new day, you remember that wigs weren't just for decoration. No. Sometimes they were a matter of national identity. A symbol, a statement, a full-blown political crisis. Let's talk about royal wig drama. Specifically, Queen Elizabeth I's wig panic of 1599, which, depending on whom you ask, either destabilized a fashion hierarchy or just mildly annoyed the Privy Council. To understand it, you need to appreciate that Queen Elizabeth didn't just wear wigs. She weaponized them. Her fiery red periwigs weren't simply stylish. They were theatrical, carefully curled, sculpted, and sprayed with more powder than a pastry shop. Her wigs became visual shorthand for majesty, control, and the divine right of ginger-haired monarchs. She had dozens, possibly hundreds. Some scholars say she wore a different wig for every type of meeting. Legal, go with stern cascade, diplomatic envoy from Spain, time for imperial flamestorm, gossiping with ladies-in-waiting, something softer like tavern curls. But in the spring of 1599, disaster struck. The Queen was attending a diplomatic banquet when, in the midst of a particularly enthusiastic toast, a draft from an open window lifted her wig. Not entirely off, just enough for onlookers to glimpse the truth. The Queen's natural hair was thinning. A perfectly normal thing, of course. She was aging, stressed, and ruling a country where rebellion was basically a seasonal sport. But this brief peek shattered something. Because Elizabeth had built her image around strength, purity, immortality. And suddenly, the illusion flickered. Historians still argue whether this moment truly caused panic, or if it was simply exaggerated by gossipy courtiers and a few opportunistic pamphleteers. But what is clear is that wig makers reported a sudden rush of noblewomen demanding new styles, taller, tighter, redder. The public message was clear: Her Majesty is strong, youthful, and fully fluffed. Meanwhile, behind closed doors, the Crown summoned its favorite wig makers and, according to one slightly dramatic account, ordered them to conceive a crown of curls so resolute, so unshakable, that even a cannon's breath shall not disturb it. The result? The iron wave. A wig so stiff it could double as a helmet. Made with a foundation of reinforced wire, goat hair, imported silks, and, some say, a touch of horse glue, it stood nearly 8 inches tall and took 3 people to position properly. It worked. Queen Elizabeth wore it to her next major address, and reportedly, a storm broke over Whitehall during her speech. The wind howled, courtiers clutched their coats, and the iron wave? It didn't budge, not a curl. Fashion was saved, the Queen's image restored, but the consequences lingered. Wig trends shifted rapidly. Everyone wanted a version of the iron wave, but few could afford it. So wig makers improvised. They stuffed wigs with rags, hay, dried fish skins, anything to give them height and hold. Some used wax. Others used plaster, which cracked dramatically during humid sermons. One woman fainted in church not from piety, but because her wig had sealed too tightly to her scalp. The wig inspectors, of course, were overwhelmed. They had to revise the rules. A new clause appeared in inspection manuals. All headwear must yield slightly to pressure of thumb, else be deemed a bludgeon. Another stated, "No wig shall impede the passing of doorways." And yet, no one wanted to stop. The iron wave had started something. Nobles hosted wig viewings, where guests arrived to display their latest creations. Prizes were awarded for height, color, and artistic themes. One man commissioned a wig shaped like a castle turret. Another arrived at a royal feast with a replica of the Thames, complete with a tiny boat sailing through his curls. It got out of hand. You walk now along a mural-painted wall near the old court stables. Faded but still visible is a caricature. A nobleman teetering under a wig so large it's being supported by 2 footmen. A tiny caption reads, "He thinketh it not heavy." But the satire couldn't stop the trend, nor could cost, discomfort, or risk of spontaneous combustion. The Queen's brief wig slip had turned the city's obsession into a frenzy, and somewhere behind it all, quietly sweating through their linen collars, stood the wig inspectors, trying, and mostly failing, to keep up. One journal entry from the time reads, "Inspected 17 wigs. 3 were decent, 1 contained a comb, 1 a coin, 1 a beetle. God help us. God help them, indeed." Morning has officially arrived, though London isn't quite ready to admit it. The rooftops gleam with dew, chimneys burp out lazy curls of smoke, and market stalls creak open like yawning mouths. A butcher sharpens his cleaver. A milkmaid curses at a goat. Life resumes. But some corners of life don't resume so much as rehearse, especially those ruled by robes, rituals, and strong opinions on wig etiquette. Today, you find yourself near one of London's quieter parishes. Stone archways, moss-lined courtyards, church bells that seem to ring more for the drama than the doctrine. And here, something fascinating unfolds: the strange relationship between wigs, dogs, and faith. It's true, religion didn't escape the madness. In fact, it got tangled right up in it. Because clergy in Elizabethan England had opinions. And when the wig craze surged, those opinions turned into sermons. Some priests condemned wigs as a sign of vanity. Others saw them as deceit, false hair to match false hearts. One fiery bishop declared, "He who powders his head hath dust where the Lord meant thought." Harsh, but catchy. Dogs fared no better. They were banned from many churches, especially during services, after a series of unfortunate incidents, barking during hymns, chasing choir boys, and once, according to an eyewitness, a particularly nervous spaniel vomiting on a bishop's shoes during communion. But despite the bans, people still brought their dogs, hidden under pews, disguised in satchels, or simply tied up outside to wait like 4-legged penitents. One notable dispute involved a preacher named Master Felix, who delivered an entire sermon on the evils of dog ownership, only for a terrier to burst through the door during his final prayer, leap into the font, and shake water across half the congregation. The church was silent. Then someone sneezed. Then someone applauded. The dog was named Reginald. He became a local celebrity. Historians still argue whether the clergy's disdain for dogs and wigs was theological or just personal. Were these creatures and coiffures truly temptations of the flesh, or just annoyingly loud and flammable? Some suggest that the church feared wigs' theatricality, seeing them as masks that distracted from divine truth. Others point to more pragmatic concerns, like lice. After all, if a bishop's powdered curls carried fleas, and those fleas leapt to a passing altar boy, you had more than a spiritual crisis. You had an outbreak, so rules were written. Clergy wigs had to be modest, no dyes, no curls beyond the curve of righteousness, and absolutely no scented powder. One regulation hilariously warned against wigs that inspire swooning. It's unclear whether that was about romantic distraction or poor ventilation, but either way, the point stood. And the dogs? Officially prohibited. Unofficially tolerated, if they were quiet, well-groomed, and preferably tied to a pillar. In fact, a few churches developed dog pew systems, small wooden stalls near the back where loyal hounds could wait during Mass. Some even had names carved in. Bess, Tomkin, Ethelbone. It was practical. And frankly, adorable. Still, not all tensions were eased. In one court record from 1607, a wig inspector was dragged before a religious tribunal for indecent conduct during Vespers. His crime? Entering the church mid-service to confiscate a priest's unauthorized wig, a curly auburn affair rumored to have been worn only during weddings. The congregation gasped. The priest fainted. The inspector was fined. But the wig? Destroyed in a small, smoky ceremony behind the vestry. Not long after, rumors spread that a ghostly voice had been heard in the chapel whispering, "I was innocent." You pause beside that very chapel now. The doors are open for morning prayers. A friar sweeps the threshold, pausing only to nod at a small, shaggy dog curled in a sunbeam near the altar. The dog lifts its head, sneezes once, and goes back to sleep. And just like that, centuries of tension dissolve into the simple truth. Some things are too embedded to ban entirely. Wigs might have been vanities. Dogs might have been distractions. But both had burrowed deep into the rhythm of the city, into worship, into work, into fashion and folly alike. You think again of Queen Elizabeth's towering wigs, of stolen periwigs floating down the Thames, of barber surgeons boiling hair in vinegar, and of poor Reginald making his splashy entrance into history, and you realize something very Elizabethan indeed. Even the sacred had to make room for the ridiculous. As the sun begins to climb properly over the chimney-stacked skyline, casting long golden fingers through warped glass windows, you make your way eastward, toward the edge of the city where superstition starts to blend into daily routine, and every cart, creak, or barking dog might just carry a deeper meaning. You're heading into the territory of tales, urban legends, whispered warnings, and strange little myths passed from one wig-covered head to another, and none looms larger than the curious case of the river dog. Now, if you mention this story in a London tavern, especially one with sawdust on the floor and a dog curled by the hearth, you'll get at least 5 different versions. All insist on different names, different centuries, and wildly different outcomes. But they all begin the same way: a dog, a barge, and the Thames. According to the most popular telling, the river dog, sometimes called Old Rummer, sometimes Thames Jack, occasionally Lord Barkington, because why not, was a stray who lived by the riverbanks near the fishmongers' piers. Not owned by anyone in particular, he was nonetheless known to all. A black and white mutt with patchy fur, one torn ear, and an uncanny knack for navigating. He'd trot aboard merchant barges as they prepared to depart, then sit squarely at the bow, growling low if the tide wasn't right, or whining when the crew tied their knots wrong. Sailors swore by his instincts. If Rummer refused to board, the trip was delayed. If he howled once before launch, all was well. If he howled twice, someone inevitably fell overboard. Historians still argue whether River Dog was a real animal or a convenient mascot, a shaggy oracle whose behavior could be interpreted to match any outcome. But the story stuck. One variation claims he once saved an entire barge by barking wildly just before a hidden sandbar. Another insists he guided a royal shipment to safety during a sudden squall. And of course, there's the dark version, the one where he disappeared one winter's night, and the fish market flooded the next morning. Ever since, fishermen supposedly tip their hats to the river at dawn, just in case he's watching. So what does this have to do with wigs? Well, believe it or not, quite a bit, because for a time, wig makers relied heavily on river trade. Imported hair, silks, powders, they all came in through barge and boat. A single snag in delivery could mean days of back orders, anxious nobles, and extremely testy wig inspectors, which made River Dog something of a silent business partner. Wig makers along the riverside would leave offerings, bits of smoked eel, bacon rind, even trimmed locks from fresh wigs, hoping to earn his blessing. One particularly desperate vendor reportedly crafted an entire miniature wig for the dog, trying to bribe fate with flair. It's not recorded whether the dog wore it, but the image alone is worth a gold sovereign. Of course, the church hated all of this. They denounced River Dog as a canine idol, a blasphemous beast of commerce and weather watching. Pamphlets were printed, sermons delivered. One preacher went so far as to splash holy water at passing barges to cleanse them of doggish influence. But the public didn't care. If anything, the legend only grew. Children began drawing chalk dogs on alley walls for luck. Vendors carved tiny wooden dogs to hang above their stalls. Even one bishop, privately of course, is said to have kept a sketch of River Dog tucked into his prayer book, right beside a pressed violet. Eventually, someone tried to monetize the myth. A clever entrepreneur built a puppet show called Rummer the River Dog Saves the Queen, complete with wig-wearing villains, exploding barges, and a heroic mutt who looked suspiciously like the street dog curled beneath the stage. It ran for weeks before being shut down by inspectors for insufficiently powdered antagonists. But River Dog remained. His image appeared in pamphlet margins, woodcuts, even etched into the side of a wig powder canister from 1613. One sample survives today in a museum collection, bearing the cheerful motto, "Trust thy dog, not thy dandruff." You smile as you walk past the water's edge now, where mist still clings to the river like breath to a mirror. The wharves are waking, ropes tightening, crates shifting, someone yelling for a missing invoice. No sign of the mythical mutt, of course. But still, a barge drifts past. At its front sits a black and white dog, tail flicking lazily. Just a mutt. Or maybe not. Maybe the legend never died. Maybe it just kept changing coats. And whether he was a real creature, a lucky omen, or simply an excuse to delay shipments during high tide, River Dog earned his place in London's long, weird history. A history where dogs gave navigational advice, wig makers prayed to stray animals, and every bark along the Thames carried just a little more weight than it should have. You leave the misty wharves behind now, climbing gently uphill toward the sprawling marketplace near Moorfields, where the city seems to shake off sleep with a snort and a stretch. The vendors shout greetings, the cobblers curse their tools, and from the corner of your eye, you spot someone struggling with a wig that's clearly 2 sizes too large, its curls swaying with every step like a haystack trying to break into song. You've arrived at what could only be described as the bazaar of the bizarre, a loosely organized, chaotically charming outdoor fair where people came to buy everything: vegetables, buttons, teeth, and yes, wigs, and sometimes dogs. Let's start with the wigs. Imagine rows of crooked stalls, their awnings patched with old theater banners and sailcloth. On the tables, heaps of wigs, tall ones, flat ones, curled like lambs or stiff like brooms, some lovingly arranged on mannequin heads, others tossed in baskets like overripe fruit. A hand-lettered sign reads, "Gently pre-worn, still good for court." You wander through, listening. 3 curls for a penny, 5 if they hold. This one's seen battle, sir, literally, used in Henry V, still smells of glory. Only slightly haunted. Hair came from a monk. Yes, this was where the city's second-hand wig trade flourished, a world of cast-offs, oddities, and the occasional unlicensed innovation, like the summer wig, advertised as hole-punched for breathability. It looked like Swiss cheese. Or the fisherman's cowl, made from eel skin, surprisingly shiny, devastatingly smelly. These weren't wigs for nobles. These were for actors, merchants, or rebellious teenagers hoping to impress at a tavern. You didn't buy prestige here. You bought personality. And if you were lucky, you might also find a wig once worn by someone famous. There's a half-confirmed tale of a bard's mop turning up here years after its owner, retired to Stratford, sold anonymously for 2 loaves and a song. Of course, wig inspectors hated this place. There was no order, no records, no rules. Wigs passed from hand to head like coins, uncatalogued, unsanitized, and often untraceable. One inspector reportedly tried to impose licensing at the fair. He was buried under a pile of used curls within minutes. Rescued eventually, but forever known as Powder Face. Yet still, the fair survived, because it wasn't just about selling wigs, it was about trading stories. You'd hear tales of cursed hairpieces that changed the wearer's accent, of powdered wigs that exploded if exposed to lemon, of a theatrical, dueling wig, laced with horsehair stiff enough to block small knives. Absolutely untrue, but what a concept. And then there were the dogs. Yes, dogs were sold, bartered, even raffled off in the same market. Right beside the sausage vendor. Some stalls specialized in puppies with ideal traits. Ratting, guarding, curling up politely. Others claimed their dogs had performance instincts, which usually meant they could stand on their back legs and beg for bacon. One stall, operated by a man called Griggs, sold only wig dogs, small, calm breeds allegedly trained to sit under wig-maker tables and provide hair through natural shedding and gentle grooming. Whether this was real or just impressive branding remains unclear, but he sold out often. Dogs were also used as live advertising. Vendors tied little ribbons to terriers and sent them trotting through the crowd wearing signs like, "My master sells hair like me," or "Follow me for frizz-free fashion." And the customers loved it. They'd pat the dogs, haggle over curls, and walk home with a new look and possibly a new companion. It wasn't hygienic, it wasn't regulated, but it was very Elizabethan. You pause now beside a quiet booth, abandoned for the day. A sign remains nailed to its front. 2 shillings a sniff, guaranteed untainted. Beneath it sits a basket with a single, oddly dignified wig, carefully curled, clearly cleaned, tied with a saffron ribbon, a tribute to what the market could be when it tried. And that's the magic of places like this. It wasn't about perfection. It was about community, about sharing laughs, side eyes, and maybe a few lice, about the thrill of finding something slightly scandalous, slightly beautiful, and utterly yours. The wig fairs and flea markets of Elizabethan London were part necessity, part rebellion, and part carnival. A place where fashion, filth, and folklore met in a powdered puff of joy. So if you ever find yourself in a marketplace that smells of dog fur, lavender, and stale mutton. Look around. You might just find the perfect wig, or a dog that knows how to wear one. The market fades behind you now, its laughter and haggling replaced by the clop of hooves and the soft squelch of mud underfoot. You've wandered into a quieter part of the city again, where the alleys narrow and the buildings lean like eavesdropping aunties. This is prankster territory. Not the serious criminals, mind you, not the cut purses or the grifters. These are the petty mischief makers, the ones who steal your wig not to sell it, but to wear it and sing opera in the street. The ones who train their dogs to sit at church doors and bark only when the preacher says, "Redemption." And most alarmingly, the ones who've discovered that wigs and dogs can be used as weapons of mild public chaos. Let's start with the most notorious incident of its kind, the case of the disappearing dean. This occurred one midsummer eve during a civic banquet. A well-respected church dean, known for his perfectly powdered periwig, was giving a toast about civic responsibility when, mid-sentence, his wig vanished. Vanished. One moment it was there, pristine, gleaming, high enough to make the chandeliers nervous, and the next, gone. The room gasped. The toast collapsed. The dean froze like a cake that had just fallen. It was later discovered that the culprit was a trained terrier named Sprig. Sprig had been hidden beneath the banquet table by a local mischief gang calling themselves the Lice and Liberty Society. The dog had been trained to snatch wigs on command and bolt. Witnesses say it exited the banquet hall with the periwig clenched in its teeth, looking very pleased with itself. The wig was never recovered. The dean retired. Sprig, reportedly, was adopted by a theater troupe. And that was just the beginning. Soon, wig pranks became a trend. One involved attaching fake periwigs to doorknobs in noble homes, so when guests went to knock, they ended up holding tufts of curly hair, much to the confusion of passing wig inspectors. Another classic involved stuffing wigs with itching powder, then returning them to lost and found boxes near parish halls. Those who reclaimed them learned the hard way that dignity is difficult to maintain while scratching behind the ear like a cartoon mouse. Historians still argue whether these pranks were political, social, or just very bored apprentices getting revenge on their powdered employers. But whatever their motive, they left their mark. In 1615, an official pamphlet titled "Wiggery and Wantonness, a Threat to Civility," warned that false locks and flea-infested curls are tools of unrest and mockery and may lead to the erosion of lawful order. It went largely unread, but still, the authorities did try to respond. In certain wards, it became illegal to carry wigs unbagged in public. Unbagged wigs were considered prank-ready. If you were caught holding one without justification, yes, that was the phrase, you could be fined or forced to sweep the town square while wearing it backwards. Meanwhile, wig inspectors began marking legitimate wigs with discreet stitching, little colored threads on the inner lining. Blue for court wigs, green for theater wigs, red for ceremonial use, and black for, well, questionable origins. If you saw someone wearing a wig with black stitching, you were encouraged to steer clear, or start a conversation, depending on your temperament. The pranksters, of course, learned to forge the stitches. Then came the era of sound wigs. That's right. Some pranksters rigged wigs with noisemakers, tiny bladder contraptions that squeaked when sat upon, or bells sewn into the base that jingled during particularly passionate sermons. One particularly infamous device was the laughing wig, which released a wheezing giggle when tipped past a certain angle. It was banned within a week. Dogs were not exempt from this madness. In fact, they became willing, or at least unaware, participants. One popular gag involved dressing small dogs in custom wigs and setting them loose near taverns. Some were styled like clergy, others like judges. The city was briefly plagued with what people called the barking bench, a roving pack of powdered poodles who seemed to be satirizing the entire legal system. Naturally, the real judges were not amused. In retaliation, one magistrate ordered all animal wigging to be punishable by 3 days in the stocks. But the stocks quickly became a stage. People came to watch the punished mock their crimes, and in one case, offer better wigs to replace the offending one. It was impossible to contain. Because at its core, Elizabethan London was a city that loved a spectacle, a place where rebellion could be disguised as fashion, and fashion could be undone with a well-timed bark. And while the wig inspectors tried, bless them, they simply couldn't keep pace with a city that saw curls not just as style, but as opportunity. Opportunity to provoke, to play, to poke holes in the powdered facade of respectability. You smile as you pass a quiet stoop where someone has left a tiny velvet wig on a sleeping bulldog. It's pink. It's absurd. It's perfect. Because deep down, London always knew, sometimes the best way to endure the rules is to laugh under a borrowed fringe. The streets are fully awake now. Vendors call out their wares with the zeal of opera singers. Milk carts rattle. Children chase each other with sticks and inexplicable shrieks. And from a rooftop comes a bark, sharp, single, and commanding. You follow it. Naturally. Because if today's lesson has taught you anything, it's that dogs in wigs, or wigs near dogs, usually mean something very entertaining is about to happen. You round the corner and find yourself near the theater district. Not the grand halls for noble patrons, but the smaller, rougher venues, the ones with creaky trapdoors, hand-painted signs, and actors who double as carpenters and occasionally debt collectors. And here, wigs were not just accessories, they were essential infrastructure. Welcome to the world of poets, playwrights, and poodles. Let's start with the playwrights. They were dramatic, poor, and highly likely to describe a foggy morning as London's breath upon the cobblestones. They also loved wigs, on stage, off stage, and occasionally in deeply inappropriate pub performances. Historians still argue whether Shakespeare wore wigs regularly, or only when he played old men and witches. But what's undeniable is that his characters wore them. Lots of them. A Shakespearean costume chest without wigs was like a sword fight with only spoons. You could do it, sure, but it wouldn't hit the same. Actors depended on wigs to shift roles. 1 minute, you're a king. Next, you're a jester. Then a grieving widow. All with a change of curls. The average Elizabethan actor changed roles and wigs so often during a play that some ran on stage wearing the wrong hair entirely. Cue audience confusion. Cue spontaneous reinterpretations of Hamlet as a very curly Dane. Then there were the poets, dramatic too, fond of metaphor and melancholy. But many couldn't afford the big, luxurious wigs, so they faked it. Floppy caps stuffed with horsehair, rags fluffed and powdered, or the classic ink-dyed mop tucked beneath a feathered hat. One particularly vain sonneteer was known for his night wig, a small, sleek periwig he claimed helped him sleep with dignity. He was once robbed in an alley and begged the thief, "Take the purse but leave the curl." He got punched. And then there were the poodles. Okay, not just poodles, but theater dogs in general were adored. They were actors, mascots, and, in at least one case, better reviewed than the humans. Meet Lord Wiggleton, a spaniel who performed for 5 years at the Red Swan Theatre. Trained to bark on cue, fetch props, and wear a variety of character wigs, Wiggleton was reportedly so talented that audiences booed if he didn't appear in a scene. He played everything from a ghost to a romantic lead, with some interpretive growling. One critic wrote, "The dog was clear of purpose and cleaner than the Duke." After his death, a short play was written in his honor, The Most Noble Cur. It featured no humans in the first act. Wig-related accidents in the theater were legendary. One tale recounts an actor stepping onto the stage with such drama that his wig flew off and landed in the lap of the mayor. Rather than return it, the mayor wore it for the rest of the show. The actor finished the scene bald and shaken. Another incident involved an overly ambitious wig built for a Greek tragedy. Its height blocked a stage pulley, causing an entire backdrop to collapse mid-soliloquy. The audience applauded. They thought it was symbolic. Wig inspectors, ever diligent, occasionally attended these performances, not for pleasure, for compliance. One report from 1606 details an inspector halting a matinee of Julius Caesar because Mark Antony's wig was unfit for martial persuasion. The play resumed after the actor borrowed a more convincing piece from an off-duty chimney sweep. Yet for all the chaos, the bond between dogs, wigs, and the arts remained strong. Some troupes even advertised their dogs in posters, featuring Mop, the dog with sorrowful eyes. One used a terrier to guard the wig chest after a rival company attempted a midnight curl heist. The dog barked so loudly, he woke half the street and, allegedly, ruined a romantic rendezvous 3 doors down. You pause now beside a faded theater door. On it, scratched in tiny cursive, are the words, "This is where we stored the wigs." Also, Mop. It's a quiet tribute. Because in a city of so much noise, sometimes the little things, curly, furry, theatrical, leave the biggest impressions. Wigs gave actors their crowns. Dogs gave plays their heart. And poets? Well, they gave everyone headaches, but occasionally a decent couplet. So the next time someone tells you fashion, pets, and art have nothing in common, just raise a brow, point to a curly-haired spaniel in the spotlight, and say, "You weren't there, man." The late morning sun is climbing now, casting long shadows behind you as the city starts to thrum with its full, messy, marvelous energy. You find yourself heading toward the edge of the parish commons, where the cobblestones grow uneven and the air smells faintly of ale, ink, and whatever someone fried in butter an hour too long. Here lies the final resting place, figuratively, not literally, of one of Elizabethan London's most curious folk heroes. A dog catcher named Hobson Trench, whose story begins with a bad day, gets worse, and ends with something oddly noble. Let's set the scene. It's 1602, summer. The plague has retreated for now, though no one trusts it. The river is low, the fleas are hiding, and the citizens of Whitechapel have been complaining loudly about the dogs again. Not the helpful ones, not the ones that bark at burglars or carry baskets for the blind. No, these were the Barking Three, a trio of particularly large mongrels known for stealing meat, chasing cats, and relieving themselves on the wheels of court officials' carriages. With flair. Enter Hobson Trench. Hobson was not the ideal dog catcher. Middle-aged, always slightly damp, known for muttering under his breath in rhyming couplets, especially when annoyed. But he took his job seriously, and the Barking Three were officially assigned to him. The chase began at dawn. Hobson wandered through butchers' alleys and down to the docks, calling out names like Barley and Scourge, in hopes that one of them might actually be the dog. He tried liver bait. He tried the noose pole. At one point, he even disguised himself as a fish vendor. Nothing worked. The Barking Three avoided him for 3 weeks, appearing only to cause theatrical mischief and vanish into fog. One chased the Bishop of St. Mary's up a ladder. Another snatched a roast chicken during a wedding procession. The third, it simply stared down a magistrate until he dropped his gavel and fled. There was even talk of a play being written about them. By week 4, Hobson snapped. He marched into the market, stood atop a vegetable crate, and declared, "I resign. Let these beasts be mayor, for they've more sense than the lot of you." The crowd applauded, not the response he expected. What happened next depends on the storyteller. Some say the dogs arrived, circled him, and sat, quiet, obedient, as if to say, "We were just testing you." Others claim Hobson fainted, and when he woke, the dogs were gone forever. A third version insists he walked out of town with the barking 3 at his side, muttering rhymes until the mist swallowed them whole. What's true? Well, the court records show Hobson never resumed his job. He was given a pension of reluctant gratitude and allowed to keep a stool in the town hall where he told stories and occasionally insulted lawyers. More curiously, the dogs were never caught, but sightings continued on rooftops, by docks, in theater crowds. Once, during a storm, a sailor claimed he saw 3 dogs sitting calmly on the bow of a merchant ship as it rode the waves, like captains of the salt air. And in time, Hobson became a kind of local legend. Children sang rhymes about him. Wig makers sold powder labeled trench white, supposedly blessed by the man himself for extra volume and moral clarity. A local artist painted him in oils, surrounded by dogs, holding a noose in one hand and a pie in the other. The caption read, "The man who quit with dignity." Historians still argue whether Hobson was a rebel, a coward, or simply tired, but in a city obsessed with rules, status, and curls, he did the unthinkable. He stopped caring. He let the dogs win, and for that, people adored him. The story took on a moral life. Poets wrote verses like, "He who chases mutts in vain will find his head still damp with rain." Not their best work, but it rhymed. Even the wig inspectors got involved. One journal entry reads, "Inspected 3 wigs, found 1 vermin, and passed a boy wearing Hobson's cut. Unpowdered, windswept, oddly noble. You pass a small alley now, unofficially known as Trenchway." Painted on the stone wall, a rough sketch of a man in a cloak, dogs at his side, one eyebrow raised, holding out a single finger, not rudely, just definitively. It's unclear who drew it, but no one paints over it. Because Hobson Trench, accidental martyr of municipal control, reminds us that even the smallest jobs can create the biggest legends, especially when dogs are involved. So, if you ever feel like quitting, do it with style, do it in verse, and maybe, just maybe, do it with a wig slightly askew and a mutt or 2 in tow. You're nearing the end of your ramble now, the city blinking in full daylight around you, banners fluttering from shop fronts, chimney smoke rising in lazy spirals, and the morning bells giving up any pretense of grace and just bonging with enthusiasm. But there's one more story lingering in the margins of this powdered epic, one last dusty page that deserves to be turned. It's the story of the last wig inspector, a tale part bureaucratic, part tragicomedy, and entirely, delightfully inevitable. Let's jump ahead a little. The year is 1633. Queen Elizabeth has long since passed. The wig game is now dominated by new fashions, new powders, and increasingly ridiculous structural engineering. One style, known simply as the twister, requires internal scaffolding and is legally advised not to be worn near fireplaces. By this point, the wig inspectors are tired. Their job has ballooned from inspecting for lice and mold to regulating style conformity, judging whether a curl is too ambitious, and writing up formal citations for unseemly bouffant flares. They've been mocked in plays, shooed out of parlors, and, on one occasion, locked in a privy by a troupe of prankster poets. One by one, they retire, disappear, or go into consulting. All except for one, Mr. Aubrey Smalls. Now, Smalls wasn't famous. He wasn't even particularly good at inspecting wigs, but he was meticulous, polite, and deeply committed to the ideals of powdered order. He wore a modest curled wig himself, gray at the edges, always brushed, always slightly off-center. He kept his tools in a velvet-lined satchel, a wooden comb, a snuff box of anti-fungal powder, and a tiny brass mirror with the initials W.I. carved on the back. Smalls inspected wigs until the very end, even as the city moved on, even when Parliament started phasing out the old-fashioned codes, even when the poets switched to beards and hats, even when actors started preferring their own hair for authenticity. Smalls still made his rounds. He still poked at wigs in street markets, still sniffed powders in dusty backrooms, still filed reports in triplicate, though no one read them anymore. They just stacked up in a wooden cabinet marked WIG-archive open parenthesis irrelevant close parenthesis. One spring morning, Smalls stood outside a fashionable cafe near Covent Garden, watching two young nobles walk by. They were both bareheaded. One had curls but natural ones. The other wore a cap. Smalls sighed, deeply. He walked down to the embankment, sat on a bench overlooking the river, and pulled out his notebook. The entry reads, "No inspections performed today. Weather fair, hair, uncontrolled, likely unpowdered." It was his last report. The next morning, he submitted his formal resignation, on parchment, sealed with wax, tied with a little saffron ribbon. Inside, just one sentence: "I concede the curls to time." He was never replaced. The position of wig inspector quietly dissolved. No ceremony, no notice, just gone. But the legacy? It lingered. Wigmakers still told stories of him. Children whispered that if you wore your hair too sloppily, Smalls would appear behind you with a comb and a sigh. One street poet even published a collection titled Aubrey's Parting Powder. And in 1640, a theater company dedicated a performance of As You Like It to the last man who cared how it looked. Even more bizarrely, a small terrier owned by a retired barber was trained to sit still whenever someone approached with a comb. The dog's name? Smalls. Historians still argue whether Aubrey Smalls's final act was resignation or resistance, whether he gave up or bowed out with dignity. But one thing's clear: he loved what he did. Even as the world left him behind, he inspected until the last curl fell. You find yourself now in a quiet garden near the former guild offices. In the far corner, half covered in ivy, there's a squat little stone. Not a grave, more like a marker. On it, chiseled into fading granite, are the words, "Here sat Smalls. He judged no man, save for how they wore their wigs." You smile. Because sometimes, history isn't just about kings and battles. Sometimes it's about the people who cared too much about silly things and made the world sillier and better because of it. And as the breeze rustles your own unpowdered hair, you wonder whether anyone will ever inspect it. Probably not. But somewhere, you hope, Smalls is nodding in approval. You linger in the garden a moment longer, watching sunlight catch on the ivy that frames Smalls' humble memorial. Beyond it, the city hums and coughs and laughs. London, always a little dusty, always in motion. You've walked its streets, followed its barking, sniffed its powders, and chased its wigs through centuries of both sense and nonsense. But before you drift off completely, There's one more thing to know. Because history isn't tidy, it doesn't always file its endings properly or tie its stories in neat little bows. And in the case of wig inspectors and dog catchers, the line between obsolete and underground legend is a bit blurrier than most. Which brings us to the rumor. Long after Smalls laid down his satchel and the barking three vanished into folklore, stories began circulating, quietly, mostly in pubs near the old city walls, about sightings. Not ghosts, not phantoms. Something weirder. An old man, well-dressed but dusty, inspecting wigs in pawn shops with a small brass mirror. A woman with a licorice-scented comb who appeared at weddings and asked guests whether they'd powdered for purity. A dog with a small velvet collar, barking only at unregistered curls. Once, a child reported being approached by a man in a tall hat who gently adjusted his mother's hair, gave a small bow, and vanished behind a curtain of laundry. There's even an 18th century newspaper snippet mentioning a fellow who claimed to be wig inspector emeritus, wandering Piccadilly with a clipboard made of lace. No one could verify any of it. But here's the thing. In a city like London, some roles never quite die. They just evolve. Wig inspectors became fashion critics. Dog catchers became animal wardens. And somewhere, buried deep in the bureaucratic DNA of the metropolis, there's still someone who cares, who leans in to check for proper curl rotation or makes a note when a mutt strolls by with too much authority. You rise from the garden bench now, feet sore, head full of flowery curls and ghostly barks. A woman passes by leading a small dog wearing a bandana that reads, "Licensed and loved." You nod. She nods back. No words are needed, because you now know what very few people do, that beneath the grime and glamour of Elizabethan London lay an entire infrastructure of the absurd, a world of rules for wigs, ribbons for dogs, and people who took both very seriously. It wasn't just about health or order or even fashion. It was about identity, authority, dignity, whether enforced with a sniff, a noose pole, or a puff of scented starch. And if someone snickered, all the better, because in the end, what is history, if not a parade of very serious people doing very silly things, and leaving behind legends fluffier than sense would allow? You step back onto the street, a breeze blows. Somewhere in the distance, a dog barks once, then twice, just to be sure. So now, as you rest your head and let your eyes soften, think of London, not the one in guidebooks, but the London of dogs dodging capture and wigs held aloft like edible sculptures. A city where the streets smelled of fish, bread, and talcum powder, where dignity could slip off your head in a gust of wind, and where someone, somewhere, was always trying to catch the uncatchable. Let yourself picture the cobbled alleys again, soft lit by lanterns, with shadows of powdered men hurrying to court, wigs bouncing slightly with each anxious step. Imagine a wig inspector standing in the rain, tapping his chin while examining a headpiece with more personality than structure, or the quiet shuffle of a dog catcher returning home, sleeves muddy, pole slung over one shoulder, wondering if the mutt he couldn't catch today might be waiting by his door tomorrow. Tail wagging. History is often written in bold lines, kings, wars, laws, but in between are the curls, the collars, the daily rituals that sound absurd until you realize they were just trying to make sense of the world, one bark and bouffant at a time. So breathe deeply now. Let the powdered past settle gently like dust. Let your thoughts wander down those uneven streets. Nothing is chasing you here. No inspections. No fines. Just stories, silly and soft, lining your thoughts like layers of lace. And if you dream tonight of wigs on dogs, or dogs in wigs, or people trying to control both with lists and ribbons, well, that's not a nightmare. That's just Elizabethan London, paying you one last visit. Sweet dreams.